I'm going to go quickly through this because there's a lot to cover. I originally planned a 2-hour interactive workshop, and that was condensed from, I run courses that sort of last for a year. So I'm sorry that it is going to be condensed. I will make the slides available afterwards for people to go through in their own time. And I'm I'm very willing to come back on another occasion if you'd like to drill deeper. So I'm going to be looking at self-directed education / natural learning / unschooling, and looking at this from the perspective of curriculum and assessment, and looking at the differences between our concepts of curriculum and assessment in this approach compared to schooled models of education. Because as the word unschooling suggests, there's actually a discontinuity between this approach to education and other forms of education. Very briefly, who am I? I started out with a psychology honors. Later on, I moved into the field of working with children's rights, particularly child participation and environmental rights, which led me to have an interest in educational rights. I then signed up for a master's in philosophy of education, but I quickly found that there was nobody in the College of Education who could actually assist me with what I was trying to learn. It was a little like trying to study nature conservation at an agricultural college. Looks like there's an overlap, but there wasn't. So I left to use self-directed processes to study self-directed education. That took about 10 years. Once I really understood what self-directed education is and that it works, then I returned to psychology to understand how and why it works. And some of that is what I'm going to be sharing with you today. So what is this approach and where does it fit into the educational landscape? We're going to start by looking down here at the green section. The foundation of this approach is actually why we call it natural learning, is because it's pretty much the way that Mother Nature or whichever greater deity you follow set up for all creatures and particularly humans to learn. So all creatures learn through play. Humans have a few extra educative drives, including, curiosity, autonomy, sociability, and planfulness. So we play and experiment with everything that's around us because we're curious and we want to do it ourselves. We're just not satisfied. You'll see even a 3-year-old is not satisfied to have somebody else do it for them. We rely on each other for information and support, and we're able to make plans and execute them and then consider the results of what we've done through an experimental process. All of this rests on our core needs as humans, which I'll be unpacking a little bit later, but these core needs are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And all of our ancestral cultures educated this way. Then, if we go up to the top to the purple, in 1964, John Holt was a teacher who started being curious about why he was seeing children in his classes fail. And he started exploring what caused those children to fail. And he went deeper into that exploration and eventually came to suggest the concept of unschooling. And he also coined that term. Without being aware of John Holt's work, I've gone completely out of order there. Sorry. 1921 is actually the original foundation of our approach in the modern age, when A.S. Neal actually founded Summerhill School. Now, A.S. Neal was a teacher who wasn't particularly concerned with improving education. He just objected to the way that children were treated at that point in history. Children were very much second-class citizens with very few rights, and he felt that children had a right to equal status with adults, to be treated respectfully, to have consent, and to participate in their own experience. So he set up Summerhill School as a boarding school so that children would be able to completely leave the social milieu of the time, which we felt was very oppressive. And there he set it up as a democracy where the children would actually help to run the place. He kept the concept of curriculum and assessment. He kept the government curriculum. It's just that the children had absolute choice as to whether or not to attend class and he discovered that most of them didn't attend class until their teens, and then they would simply drop in and catch up very quickly. And Summerhill School is still open today. Then, without being aware of John Holt's work, which had started a few years before, Daniel Greenberg and company in the 60s, late 60s, were very inspired by Summerhill School, and they set up Sudbury Valley School. They were initially going to set up something just like Summerhill, but they decided to let go of two aspects. They let go of the boarding school aspect because they felt that parents had evolved a little since 1921 and would now be able to support their children in being able to be respectfully treated, even if they had access to them after hours. And he also decided to drop the curriculum and assessment and instead replace that with full autonomy and empowerment for the children. So he said, we'll find out if the children want classes, then they will ask for them. And that was how Sudbury Valley School was founded. And what they discovered is that the children very seldom asked for classes. It does happen, but not often. In 1986, Dr. Peter Gray's research came out. He actually had a very strong-willed son who didn't fit into the normal schooling system and refused to participate, and I'll be going into some of that shortly. And he found that Sudbury Valley School was the only school that his son would consent to participate in. When they tried other systems, his son would literally just walk out or disrupt or basically make a mockery of the work that he was given in the way that he did his homework and assignments. But then Dr. Peter Gray, being an evolutionary psychologist researching, wanted to know whether this would work. And so he started to drill into where does this come from? And he then studied the graduates of Sudbury Valley School. He also studied the practices of ancestral cultures. And then eventually he also studied unschoolers. And putting all of these together, he coined the term self-directed education, because that is what he found all of these approaches have in common. So, what is the approach? So what Dr. Gray found is that given the right optimizing conditions, support, and resources, children educate themselves and we don't need to do it for them. Now, this is quite important because often when people look at unschooling, they think that it's just a kind of free-for-all, maybe bordering on neglect. The optimizing conditions are actually important, and they give us a roadmap for best practice. So these optimizing conditions are, firstly, the social expectation and reality that education is children's responsibility. It's important that the children get this message, that it really is up to them. And nobody is going to be sort of nannying after them, and they actually need to be taking responsibility for their own education. The second one is that they need unlimited time to play, explore, and pursue their own interests. They also need the opportunity, and therefore obviously also the access, to play with the tools of the culture. Now that would range from books and sewing machines, or in hunter-gatherer times, bows and arrows, whatever it may be in that culture. And of course, we see in our own times, digital tools are very, very prominent, and there's a reason that children have an instinct that zooms them in on those to play with them as much as possible. Also very important is access to a variety of caring adults who are helpers, not judges. As much as this is something that, as we see in number 5, free age mixing among children and adolescents is very important, it's also incredibly important to have access to adults who are knowledgeable and are there to help answer questions and give guidance when asked. But part of the point of this is that they cannot be judges, which we'll come to a little bit later when we look at assessment. Immersion in a stable, supportive, and respectful community is important for this approach. It's not something one can do in complete isolation. And there needs to be a freedom to exchange and debate ideas, that children can actually argue and develop their own points of view rather than simply accepting what other people say or feeling pressured to kind of toe the official line. And then the final optimizing condition is empowerment, the ability to shape and impact the learning environment, which is why in self-directed spaces, you'll find that there's a participatory democracy, whether it's in the home or in a facility, that the children actually get to have a say in how things happen, and decisions are made together rather than simply being made by the adults and handed down. How this fits in to the bigger map. So when we look at state schooling, we are going to see an education system that will embody the goals, the values, the worldview, and the content and the methods and the timing favored by the mainstream in that particular society. So each different country with its own culture is going to have its own approach to its state education, depending on that goal and value set. Then when there's an alternative, if we go to the left there, when there's an alternative approach, maybe because of religion or lifestyle or culture, then we will see some form of lifestyle education. Often this is part-time. For example, initiation school or Sunday school. It can also be full-time when you get a philosophy, for example, like a Waldorf school or the German school that's based around language and culture. That would then be a lifestyle education approach. On the opposite, going to the right, when the parents bring in their own choice of their goals, their values, their worldview, their feelings about the content, methods, and timing, then we get what we generally call, in a blanket sense, home education, which can be incredibly diverse because it does depend on the parents' worldview. And then pointing down towards the bottom, that's where we get self-directed education / natural learning and unschooling. And that is an approach that is shaped by the learner's own goals, values, worldview, content, methods, and timing. And this is where in a family that is using this approach, you can see completely different educational paths for each child in the family. To put a little more detail here, obviously there are intersects. So there on the left, you'll see that in between state schooling and the alternative set, you'll find your independent schools. They're still following CAPS. They're still basically doing the same thing as the state schooling, except that they're doing it as independent schools, and many of those schools have a bit more of that sort of lifestyle flavor. Some of them are religious schools or special language schools, for example. On the right-hand side, you've got the intersect between the state schooling and the home education, which again, you'll find still CAPS is happening here. Often this will be through cottage schools that do CAPS or tutor centers that support or home ed curriculums that are still CAPS-based and still would follow that curriculum and assessment process that the state has set up. Obviously, this is South Africa specific, but that would apply, to whichever country we're looking at. Now, if we can imagine this model being 3D, because obviously this is a 2D diagram, there's also obviously an intersect between the home education and the lifestyle education, in that some of those home ed curricula will be specific lifestyle curricula. You could choose a Sunlight Christian approach, for example, or you might take a Waldorf approach home, or you might decide that you're going to use your curriculum from your country of origin, from if you're an immigrant or you've got a certain genealogy. And then, of course, there's also an intersect between the home education and the self-directed education. And there's sort of a gradation that tends to go in that direction. So we consider something like eclectic schooling would be a little bit more in the direction of self-directed, while not really going all of the way there. And then what we call relaxed homeschooling, where you might find a family following a curriculum for maths and English, for example, but giving the children free time to pursue all other interests in their own way. And then we get down to the actual section of self-directed natural learning. And then there are settings there on the left, which would be, for example, microschools and democratic schools. There's now a large number of these around the world in all different countries. And then, of course, unschooling families. So the important thing to focus on is that this approach does not lend itself to large centralized systems. It's ideal for individuals and small groups of up to a maximum of around 250 people. Now, obviously, these can be networked into much bigger groups, but the actual practice doesn't lend itself, for example, to schools of 600 or 2,000 people at a time. It's very much a community, in-person, interactive approach to education. So it's ideal for networked families and microschools, and it's ideal for shared resource circumstances also, since resources don't have to be duplicated for each learner, which makes it very, very cost effective compared to centralized systems, which I think is one of the great gifts that maybe the DBE could explore, especially for rural areas where classes are naturally small. I think we could really talk there in terms of how we could maybe bring some gifts. The goals, methods, and timing of self-directed education are unique to each individual learner. And this means that our so-called curriculum is unique to each learner. And it can only be seen with hindsight. And I'm going to briefly give two beautiful examples. The one is from my own experience of a 6-year-old who spent enormous amounts of time not at all interested in learning to read and write, but throwing dust into the air and throwing things into the air. And, you know, from a conventional perspective, we would look at that and say, gosh, that's a waste of time. What is that child doing? Let's get them doing something constructive. By the age of 9.5, there was an interest in learning to read, and it was completely caught up within a year to the point of reading adult fiction by the age of 11. And that throwing things in the air turned out to have given a deep intuitive understanding of aerodynamics for a learner who's very interested in physics today, who's now a teen. Then an example from the literature from Sudbury Valley School. There was a very, very talented young writer who spent the last year at Sudbury Valley just arranging parties. And the staff were kind of looking at this and thinking, gosh, she's maybe wasting her time. She should be working up a portfolio of written pieces, etc. But with hindsight, it turned out that she needed to develop her social networking skills because she turned out to be an investigative journalist. And by arranging all of those parties, she actually gave herself the experience and confidence that she needed in order to be able to get the stories that then became her trademark. So that's where our concept of curriculum is a very, very different concept. And it's something that the facilitator doesn't necessarily have to be able to track. We trust the intuitive process that unfolds from within each learner. Likewise, assessment of SDE can only be done by the learner themselves in terms of their own level of satisfaction with what they've achieved. We'll often see a learner be very, very happy with quite a low level of achievement for quite a while, and then they seem to go through a stage where they suddenly have the desire to master something much more complex, and it's all very unpredictable, and we can't really tell what they need to achieve when. It tends to be in adulthood that we can only really see what the outcome is of their learning. Now, that feels very risky and it's difficult to trust. And this is where we say SDE is wonderful for children and hell for their parents, because it makes it difficult to track. Now, standardized curriculum and assessment do make standardized mass education manageable for those who bear the responsibility to manage it. I actually had a bit of an exercise planned for if we were going to do this in person, of trying to arrange people and patterns on the floor. And when you've got just a few people, it's very easy to just get them to do it themselves, to get themselves to make a particular pattern on the floor. But if you have 10 million people, you sort of need to put dots on the ground for them to stand on. Otherwise, it's going to be a mess. So standardized curriculum and assessment are arguably, absolutely, maybe in the best interest of the educational bureaucracy. However, it does not follow that standardized curriculum and assessment are necessarily in the best interests of any one specific learner. And it's important for us to remember that the best interests of the child are paramount in all matters concerning the child, including their education. If we're used to standardized curriculum assessment, it's easy to assume that this is just what education is, and also to assume that this is because it's best for the learner. However, This is actually just something we do now because it's how it's done. It actually hasn't been researched. There's a lovely quote here from Professor Eugene Matusoff at the University of Delaware, who says that modern conventional education is full of impositions on its students, such as what, how, and where students do learn, behave, attend, participate, and communicate in the ways that the teacher and school define. For certain ages of students, schooling itself is compulsory in modern societies and thus imposed. However, the legitimacy of this imposition in terms of how much of this imposition is necessary, useful, justified, and desirable for education itself has not been specifically discussed and analyzed yet. So to understand why standardized forms of curriculum and assessment are at odds with self-directed education and unschooling, we need to take a quick look at the following. Now, I'm going to whiz you through this, and if you're interested in going deeper, let me know. We're going to look very briefly at the motivational theories of DC and Ryan. We're going to look briefly at the conscious competence learning model, and we're going to look at Csikszentmihalyi's theory of flow. So Richard Ryan and Edward DC are psychologists who put together a huge team of hundreds of psychologists around the globe, and they've been going for decades. They have identified 3 core needs that all humans share. There might be more, but these are the ones they've proven beyond reasonable doubt everybody has. These are a need for autonomy, a need to feel competent and good enough, and a need to belong and feel that we can care and be cared for, which is relatedness. They have done cross-cultural studies on this quite extensively, and they have not found an instance where somebody whose needs are compromised still experiences a high level of well-being. We all need these 3 needs to be met to a sufficient level in order for us to be well. And also different individuals have different levels of need for each of these needs. Now, you'll probably have heard about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. This is the team that coined those phrases. That's from their early work. As they continued to research, they found that more important for predicting motivation is actually what they call controlled motivation versus autonomous motivation. So autonomous motivation would be the motivation that comes from inside us. It's what we do spontaneously because it feels right to us. And what they found is that this can be intrinsic or extrinsic. So for example, if I love to dance because it feels good and I just love doing it and my body just insists that I dance. That would be intrinsic motivation, where I'm doing it for its own sake. But if I'm a good dancer, I also might decide that I want to do my ballet exams, for example, or enter a modern dancing competition. It's still me who's choosing to do it. It's coming from inside me, but I am doing it for some kind of reward that is on the outside. So that would be extrinsic autonomous motivation. And what Ryan and DC found is that autonomous motivation is very sustainable. As long as we're in charge of our choices, we tend to continue doing the thing because we find it intrinsically rewarding, and it fulfills our need for autonomy to feel that we are in charge of our choice. Controlled motivation can only be extrinsic, because controlled motivation works through rewards and punishments, even if these are quite subtle. For example, things like praise or fear of shame or fear of people thinking you're weird. All of these are extrinsic rewards and punishments, and this can be used to control somebody else's motivation, to get them to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. Now, the interesting finding from Ryan and DC is that we can turn autonomous motivation into controlled motivation by using rewards and punishments. And at that point, there's a danger of extinction of the behavior. Ironically, you can get someone to stop doing something by rewarding them for it and then stopping the rewards. I actually saw this before I knew anything about this theory when my son was just 2 and he went to a party for toddlers. And they were playing that magnetic fishing game where you have the little stick with the magnet and then the little wooden fisher or plastic fisher in the water with a little metal piece on them. And then they fish for the fishes. And I thought, oh, wow, I know he loves this game so much. He's going to be there for hours. And I was quite amazed that he was just there for a few minutes and then he got bored. And I watched to see what was actually the reason. And they were using this fishing game to give out the party packs. So each time the child got a fish, then they would get another sweetie to put in their little packet. And after about 4 turns, their packet was full and there were no more sweeties. And at that point, the children completely lost interest in the game, even if previously they'd found it a really rewarding exercise. So this is something that can happen that we need to bear in mind as we go forward into the rest of our information. So most educational approaches aim to actively motivate learners using rewards and punishments, preferably through positive means such as rewards and encouragement. But this often backfires because these strategies, such as even praise and even encouragement, can actually undermine the meeting of that core need for autonomy, depending on the personality of the learner. On the other hand, self-directed education does not aim to motivate learners, but simply aims to treat everyone with respect and care, which has the effect of paying attention to the need for consent and building relatedness and meeting the need for autonomy and the sense of competence. And as a result, motivation arises as a byproduct of being treated this way because the core needs are met. So essentially, SDE works through autonomous motivation. Our aim is to support curiosity and initiative so that learning is driven by the learner with the adult facilitator in an assistant position rather than in a driving position or a guiding position. By avoiding as many impositions as possible, the autonomy needs of the learner are met to a high level. And by allowing the learner to be the only assessor of their progress, competency needs are met to a high level. For example, if you look at a little child just starting to learn to read, they will tell you that they can read when they are just turning the pages of the book and telling the story. But because they feel competent, their motivation stays high and they keep working at it. If we get involved at that point and tell them, no, you're not really reading, that's not how it really works, we have a high risk of denting their motivation because we damage their sense of competence, and then they can often lose interest in the task. So also by working together in a way that sees adults and young people as equals, without adults being treated as authority figures, and with great care given to consent, relatedness needs are met to a high level. And when all of these core needs are met in the learning space, then well-being and autonomous motivation are very high. And this is what leads to the outcomes that we see in SDE. So we've got now 100 years of various expressions of this approach, showing that the results of this approach are at least equal to other approaches. Young people who want to get into tertiary institutions do manage to do so, and they do well there. And graduates of this approach have capable adult lives and careers. So Daniel Greenberg, who founded Sudbury Valley School, and Peter Gray both studied independently the graduates of that school. Renuka Ramroop in South Africa has studied unschoolers in our own country. And all of these studies, including others that I'm not mentioning here, again, if you want to drill deeper, let me know. But they all find that SDE learners do end up learning pretty much the same skills as the rest of the youth over time because life demands that they do. You can't get very far without being able to read. You can't get very far without being able to do enough maths to look after your money. And you can't get very far without additional skills that will actually help you make your way in the world. However, these skills are learned using different content that is personalized and on a different timeline from learner to learner. So even within one family, you can see 2 children learning to read, for example, in completely different ways and at completely different ages. This makes the approach very good for specializations, especially children who are very talented in a particular field, and for fulfilling the unique potential of the individual learner, because they've got plenty of time to pursue their strengths, not being distracted with demands from an external imposition. It does make it very hard to standardize and very hard to track bureaucratically. And I think this is where between the DBE and the unschooling community, we need to sort of navigate this mismatch of needs here and figure out how to do this in a win-win way. You essentially cannot assess an SDE learner according to benchmarks set for standardized systems without getting a wildly misleading picture. In this approach, the child who seems to be behind at 9 can easily be ahead at 11. For example, the learner that I mentioned earlier who had no interest in reading until 9.5 and was reading adult fiction by 11, giving everyone a headache around what content that person could actually be exposed to. On the other hand, the most comprehensive designed curriculum possible. Seymour Papert, the originator of AI, another proudly South African origin who moved to the US, unfortunately, he said that around 1/1,000,000,000 of 1% of what there is to know is what you can possibly fit into a designed curriculum. And this is necessarily selected by someone with specific perspectives, values, and vested interests. So every standardized curriculum has to rely on luck if it's going to coincide with this particular learner's interests on this particular day. And because that's only going to happen very rarely, mostly learners will have to be kept in their seats using controlled motivational strategies like rewards and punishments. The result of that is that many learners will not retain what they're taught because they're not interested in it at the time that they learn it. We see this, for example, with the concept of the so-called summer slide in America, where learners who've mastered something and passed their exams just before the 3-month break don't still retain that knowledge at the end of the holiday. We also see it, I see it all the time on my neighborhood WhatsApp group, where parents are struggling to help their own children with homework that they covered themselves at the same age. Because the learning has subsequently been lost. Everything that a learner spends time on that they don't retain has an opportunity cost because it's time that they didn't get to spend learning something more personally meaningful, more likely to be personally useful, and that could have been retained. And for this reason, self-directed learners tend to really resent imposed curriculum. Learners with a high need for autonomy also do not learn well under controlled motivation, and they can find curriculum and assessments very demotivating. They learn best in their own way according to their own changing interests and readiness. These learners often struggle in a large standardized system and do better when they're in charge of their own pace and content, which obviously has impact on the system, which we'll talk about in a minute. So imposing standardized curriculum and assessments on these learners when they're already outside of the standardized system isn't in their best interests, and it can even put them off subjects that they would otherwise love, and in some sad cases, put them off the idea of learning altogether. I've seen some kids who, if you say the word learning, they feel like they have to run, which is really sad. Also, for students who are sensitive about their achievement level relative to their peers, having an imposed curriculum can impact their motivation as well. Everybody's brain matures differently. Tackling a learning task before they're personally ready can dent their confidence for later. And imposed assessment, especially when it focuses attention on deficits and mistakes, can heighten the negative impact on these learners, causing not only suboptimal educational results, but also mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. So to understand this in more detail, we're going to take a quick look at the conscious competence learning model. So Martin Broadwell noticed that we all start from a place of not knowing that there's something to know, and not knowing that we don't know something. If I've never seen a guitar, I've got no idea. Also, if I've only seen people playing guitars and it looks so easy, I can think, oh, I'll be able to do that because I don't know that I don't know how to play, which leads to something called the Dunning-Kruger Effect, where often people think that they are experts when they actually know very, very little, just because they don't know enough about the thing to realize how little they know. And this is also something we need to be careful of when we look at each other's curricular approaches. Each of us is an expert in what we know well, And we can assume that we understand someone else's curricular approach very well when in fact we don't. So the next step from there would be to become aware that we know that we don't know. We become conscious of our incompetence. And at that point, we also then have the opportunity of saying, oh, okay, I will learn. I now realize I don't know how to play a guitar. I'm going to go for lessons. And I can get to the point where now I do know how to play the guitar. But I maybe still have to follow the chord structure and think about where to put my fingers. Then I'm at that third stage of conscious competence. From there, if I go to a mastery level, I can actually achieve an unconscious competence level where I don't have to think about anything. I can do things by habit. For example, that's where you have to get to if you're going to become a good driver. You don't want to be thinking about changing the gears. You're just going to do it. And it's interesting, at that level, you can also get experts having a sense of imposter syndrome because it feels so easy to them that they can't believe that they're actually special. And they don't realize just what a level of expertise they have. Now, it doesn't follow that we automatically are going to go on and learn everything that we realize we don't know. A lot of things simply don't interest us enough to progress very far. So progress around that model isn't automatic. Now, imposed curriculum can push us to tackle things that we don't personally value. And then we're also not likely to go all the way around that cycle. We might get consciously competent, but we're not likely to get to mastery. And if we're pushed to do it against our interest, we're more likely to develop an aversion to them and not be very good at them at all. What my concern is more when we do value the learning area, then there are two very different things that can happen at that second stage with vastly different impacts on the progress or not to stage 3. And the two things that can happen there is that we can go into curiosity, which would be the positive effect, and we could alternatively go into shame, which becomes a problem. When we realize that we don't know and we are supposed to know, it can be a very shaming experience. So this will determine whether we are going to continue on to stage 3, because curiosity is very motivating. I want to learn and I feel safe to learn and I'm going to give it a try. However, if I feel shame that I should know this and I don't know this and everybody knows I don't know this, that's when we're going to get all of these other effects that we often see in the imposed curriculum and assessment system. So if we go into a feeling of shame about not knowing, then we actually no longer move forward to the third stage. We actually don't work on building our competence and making the learning task successfully. Instead, we might go into despair or anxiety, into depression. Many children might start cheating to create the impression that they know more than they do, so as not to be publicly shamed. They might go into denial that it's worth learning, a kind of retreat into sour grapes. So maths is for nerds and I'm not a nerd, or into a kind of I'm not good enough dent to their self-esteem. They might start avoiding trying anything that they might fail at, which can prevent them developing additional skills. They can go into avoidance behaviors, acting up and acting out, becoming disruptive. And of course, they can go into fight, flight, freeze reactions, which could range from rebellion as a fight reaction to school refusal as a freeze reaction and more. Also, for some learners, assessment itself creates shame because of exactly the dynamics that we just looked at. Assessment that focuses on mistakes and assessment that ranks children against each other is more likely to create shame. And this can prevent the learner from engaging with that learning area in future, maybe even when their brain is more mature and ready for the task, which we often see, for example, with children who are pushed to read before they're ready and then come to believe that they can't, and they might have a lifelong literacy problem. And also very, very common in our culture at the moment is the maths allergy, where it seems to be common experience that people hate maths, which is actually a beautiful, exciting, wonderful subject. Just for many of them, they're coming at it too soon in a way that creates shame. So imposed curriculum tries to bypass this problem and prevent shame by moving learners directly from not knowing that there's something to know to teaching them about it before they can actually realize that they don't know it. So we go straight from stage 1 straight across to stage 3. So before you know anything about dolphins, I'm now going to give you a lesson today to tell you all about dolphins. And you don't actually need to go through that stage of thinking, oh, I know nothing about dolphins. The problem with this is that it can actually prevent the growth of curiosity. So, for example, most maths and science insights at the moment are taught by directly teaching the solution rather than letting the student grapple with the problem, which also makes the subject less interesting. Curiosity actually takes time to build up. We need to wonder about the thing in order to get excited, in order to get that drive really building, which means that most learners in an imposed situation aren't actually ready for the lesson. They don't feel engaged or interested, and this can cause exciting material to feel very dull. And again, it can actually cause a lot of disruption in your classrooms. On the other hand, the SDE approach deliberately allows students to spend time exploring and discovering for themselves, letting curiosity build, without the pressure of curriculum and assessment that make shame more likely. And this allows students to move on to learn and master skills in their own way and in their own time. And another result of this, the third part that I want to bring into our quick look at motivation, is that it allows SDE students to experience flow states. Now, this is a phrase coined by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, a researcher into happiness. And he said that flow is a state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience is so enjoyable that people will continue to do it even at great cost for the sheer sake of doing it. This is also where we see peak experiences, where time just stops existing, where people might forget to eat. They are just having such a wonderful time in whatever it is that they are doing. And Csikszentmihalyi came to this because he discovered that experiencing flow states is actually really important for mental health and happiness. We do need to have a certain proportion of our time spent in at least some degree of a flow state in order to be mentally healthy and happy. This diagram briefly shows us how flow works. Flow happens when we've got a good balance between our skill level and the challenge that we're confronted with, that we need to use those skills to meet. So, for example, I'm not going to have much fun if I'm trying to read a novel and I don't know how to read. It's going to put me into anxiety if I'm still at the cat on the mat stage and there's long polysyllabic words in the first sentence. I'm going to have anxiety. I'm not going to enjoy myself. On the other hand, if I'm an advanced reader and, I've been reading War and Peace, and now you're going to make me read The Cat Sat on the Mat level, read a beginner books, I'm going to be bored out of my skull. I'm not going to be in a flow state. Whereas when I've got a really good book with a really great story that's completely immersive and it's just at the right level for my reading skill, with a little bit of push to up my skill, that's when I'm going to be getting into a flow state. When I'm doing something simple, like maybe playing a simple game on my phone that gives me a challenge that matches my skill, I'm going to have a fairly low level experience of flow down there in the corner, the low and the low. So it's going to be nice. It's going to be pleasant. I'm going to like it, and it's going to help my mental health maybe to take that break, get me ready for the next challenge of the day. But if I want to have a real peak experience, I'm going to need to do something that's actually very challenging and for which I have a high level of skill. So you will see, for example, your peak performers in sports and the arts will reach very, very high-pitched states of flow, peak experiences, because they've honed their skills to the heights of mastery, and then they get themselves into a competitive challenge, for example, or a big audience performance challenge, where the challenge is very, very high and they need all their skill to meet it. And that's kind of the peak of human ecstasy experience in that experience. Now, what this means is that for learning, when we are able to balance our own anxiety and boredom levels, we're able to take ourselves more easily into flow because we can tweak the task and our engagement with it. And the natural tendency is to raise the challenge level. If you see a child who can't ride a bicycle, they will be determined to ride the bicycle. Once they can ride the bicycle, they want to do it with no hands. There's this human instinct that we know that raise the challenge level, raise the skill level, will actually raise the ecstasy potential of that experience. So for this reason, SDE allows the learner to choose their challenges and adjust their own levels of anxiety and boredom so that flow is easier to achieve. And this is why we often have very high levels of achievement and learners tackling difficult challenges just for fun, because they've learned by experience that the more they develop the skill, the more intense will be the peak experience, and they push into bigger and bigger challenges just because it feels good. On the other hand, when we prescribe tasks and timelines, this can make it difficult for the same students to adjust their own anxiety and boredom levels, preventing them entering flow states, and they can actually start believing that learning isn't a great way to get flow. They might disengage from learning tasks and seek easier things, easier ways to get flow, such as just playing games on their phones or even simulating flow feelings with the same neurochemicals through drugs and alcohol. And even crime, unfortunately, can become a challenge and dare situation that can create a flow state. So just to note that the current school system is plagued exactly by learners who don't do well with curriculum assessment, having to be subjected to curriculum assessment and responding in ways that disrupt the control that curriculum assessment is meant to achieve. So it can actually backfire when curriculum assessment is applied to learners for whom it doesn't fit. It can make the system harder to manage instead of easier, which was the point in the first place. Now, we often find kids who've been expelled from everywhere else coming over to SDE, and many of them really thrive once they're free of that imposition, if they are given proper SDE support instead of being neglected, which again is a very important distinction. So this brings us to the question of why there's an uneasy relationship at the moment, where unschooling parents feel like the DBE is the enemy, when in fact, as far as I can see, what the DBE is just trying to do is protect the best interests of the child. So imposing standardized curriculum assessment on unschooling isn't compatible. It's like Henry Ford saying, you can have any color of your car that you like as long as it's black. And when the DBE gives unschooling families the impression that they will be forced to use standardized curriculum assessments, these families know that it's not actually in the best interests of their child. Many unschoolers have arrived at unschooling through this path, where they've actually come from state school or from an independent school. Then they've tried going a bit more relaxed. They've tried home ed. They've tried other curricula, and they've ended up finding out that only actually an unschooling approach is going to work for that child, which means they've already been there and done that, and they've seen that it puts a strain on the parent-child relationship and the mental health of the child, which puts them in a position of having to choose between complying with curriculum and assessment, betraying their role as protectors of the child's best interests, or stepping up to protect the child's right to optimal education and well-being through civil disobedience, which isn't ideal. Because the DBE is familiar with standardized curriculum, in order to protect the right to education, it feels like the obvious thing to do. But the best way to prevent abuse and neglect in unschooling families is actually to ensure support for parents in understanding and achieving best practice, providing access to information and resources for kids and parents, and allowing high empowerment for kids to access and shape their choose their learning experiences independent of what their parents' beliefs and values may be, which is why SDE comes with a high focus on children's rights and participatory democracy. So I am in my last two slides now. So just to summarize, the problem if the DBE starts to give unschooling families the impression that they will have to use standardized curriculum in assessment is that it drives these families underground. And staying under the radar actually prevents the effective networking that's actually going to support that best practice, meaning that it can actually backfire, that the DBE can accidentally ensure that the unschooling child's best interest is undermined rather than served. So what if the DBE officially sanctioned the creation of independent above-board resource networks for the support of SDE families, resource centers, social networks, and micro-facilities, so that optimal access and empowerment for unschooling children could be provided? And as you said at the beginning, Sybil, what if we went in a spirit of sharing the gifts that we've all learned together? And my last slide is just a suggestion. What we've learned in SDE, because I know that every culture of learning, every classroom will benefit from building a culture of curiosity. And here are some suggestions on how to do that. And that's my time.